I will be handling this episode of Classic Album Replay a bit differently. For a number of years, Led Zeppelin, and this album in particular, has been the subject of criticism and scrutiny as to whether the band plagiarized the work of other music recording artists. Some of this criticism has been well-founded, and some of it has not. And I'm going to find it impossible to not comment on these claims as I discuss the songs on this album. I am a big Led Zeppelin fan, but Zeppelin I is not my favorite Zeppelin album. It is, though, an amazingly strong debut album, and listening to it with the benefit of hindsight, you can hear how this album foreshadows everything that would follow during their studio career. The use of blues, thunderous metal, acoustic folk, Celtic music, Indian and Arabic music, epic instrumental outings, and using the recording studio as an instrument itself. Even the songs on the album themselves would give foreshadowing echoes of things to come. Stairway to Heaven is foreshadowed in Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. Kashmir is foreshadowed by Black Mountainside. I could go on, but hopefully you get the point. The history of this first album begins with the disbanding of guitarist Jimmy Page's former band, the Yardbirds. Page had the rights to the band name and put together what was intended to be the New Yardbirds in order to finish a Scandinavian tour that was already booked. The band's name was changed to Led Zeppelin during the tour. Recorded before they were signed to Atlantic Records and self-funded by Jimmy Page, the recording process spanned 36 hours, or a few weeks of studio time. The band was able to record this album quickly because all the material for this album had already been well rehearsed by the band from their tour. This accounts for why the album has such a feeling of immediacy to it and its tremendous sense of energy. With the exception of Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You and Your Time Is Gonna Come, it feels like the majority of the tracks were probably recorded mostly live, with studio overdubs added afterwards. The album was also produced by Page, who had paid attention during his session days about how recordings were done and even pioneered a few recording innovations himself. Up until the late 1960s, most music producers placed microphones directly in front of the amplifiers and drums. For Led Zeppelin, Page developed the idea of placing an additional microphone some distance from the amplifier, as far as 20 feet, and then recording the balance between the two. By adopting this distance equals depth technique, Page became one of the first producers to record a band's ambient sound, the distance of a note's lag time from one end of the room to the other. I should note that that last paragraph was taken freely from Wikipedia. Track 1, Good Times, Bad Times, is a bit of an anomaly for Led Zeppelin. It is a short song, or perhaps I should say short by what would be soon considered to be Zeppelin standards for song lengths. It's also a fairly radio and commercial-friendly song, once again by Zeppelin standards. Its opening E major riff bar chord lets the first-time listener know that this band is going to rock and rock hard. This opening riff would come off as very Black Sabbath-like, if not for John Bonham's syncopated drum work offsetting it and adding a bit of swing to what might have been an otherwise clunky hard rock riff. Plant's lyrics are fine and serve the song well, even if they lack a certain amount of coherence. Robert Plant sings about losing his woman to a brown-eyed man, which I sometimes suspect might be a deliberate nod of the hat to the Chuck Berry song, Brown-Eyed Handsome Man. But then he goes on to say that he still doesn't seem to care. Well, if he doesn't care, then why sing about it? Or perhaps saying you don't care was the swaggering macho way of dealing with loss during that time. Later in the song's closing, Plant sings, I don't care what the neighbors say, I'm going to love you each and every day. It's a great line, but didn't he lose the girl earlier in the song? At the end of the day, I suppose it doesn't really matter that much. Good Times, Bad Times is not my favorite Zeppelin song, but it is a good solid hard rock song, and it lets you know that a thunderous heavy guitar sound will define a great deal of this band's music in the years to come. Track 2, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, is my personal favorite on this album, and one of my favorite Zeppelin songs in general. On the original vinyl release, the credits listed this song as traditional, arranged by Page and Plant, meaning that it is a public domain folk song, and that the original author is unknown, and that Page and Plant created this arrangement. This last part is true, but as it turned out, the song was not a traditional folk song. It was originally written and recorded back in the 1950s by Ann Bredon, an American folk singer and songwriter. Jimmy Page is reported as saying that there was no intention to rip off Ann Bredon. He thought he was just adapting a traditional folk song that he had heard recorded by Joan Baez. This explanation is highly possible, especially in the pre-digital information highway age. The original Baez album also credits the song as traditional, arranged by Joan Baez, although it is properly credited in the sheet music release at the same time. So it is very possible that Page got his information on the song from Joan Baez's album. Bredin herself did not hear the Zeppelin version till the 80s. She has since received back royalties and credit as the original author. I can believe that in this instance that it is possible that Jimmy Page thought he was just recording a version of a public domain song. Like Stairway to Heaven, the main body of Babe I'm Gonna Leave You is based around an A minor chord with a descending bass line. There is an obvious Spanish classical guitar influence. In fact, aside from this song, I can't think of any other example where Jimmy Page has delved into Spanish classical guitar like he has on this song. When the band kicks in and starts to rock out, it's the same chord progression as the verse, but with bar power chords on electric guitar. But even on this section of the song, the acoustic guitar does not get lost in the arrangement. Especially startling is the acoustic refrain with the electric slide guitar in the background that creates a tremendous sense of longing and loss. Babe I'm Gonna Leave You is 6 minutes and 40 seconds long, but it sure doesn't feel like it. Just as Good Times, Bad Times told you that the band is here to rock, Babe I'm Gonna Leave You says, but wait, there's more to us than just heavy guitars and thunderous power chords. Babe I'm Gonna Leave You may be a largely acoustic track, but for my money, it is many times darker and even bigger sounding than the album's opening. There's a mystical, otherworldly quality to it that would appear again and again on Zeppelin songs like Kashmir, When the Levee Breaks, and Stairway to Heaven. When we were teenagers, me and my buddies commented that the second half of Babe I'm Gonna Leave You sounded too much like 25 or 6 to 4 by Chicago. But Babe I'm Gonna Leave You was released in 1969, and 25 or 6 to 4 was released in 1970. In 1996, Green Day would use a very similar guitar riff in their song Brain Stew. Neither band has challenged the other over the use of this, and I suspect that there are a lot of other songs out there using the bass line that goes downward chromatically over the same guitar chord. Now I'm going to go out of order and cover both track 3, You Shook Me, and track 8, I Can't Quit You Baby, because of their shared history with blues legend Willie Dixon. You Shook Me is a blues song with a somewhat complex history. The song started out as a blues instrumental released on Chief Records entitled Blue Guitar by Earl Hooker. The song was successful, and Chief Records, wanting to capitalize on its success, wanted Muddy Waters to use it as a backing track for one of his records as well. Waters overdubbed a vocal onto the original Earl Hooker recording, and the lyrics were written by Willie Dixon and J.B. Lenore, and the song then became You Shook Me. On this recording, Waters' vocal melody just doubled Earl Hooker's guitar melody line, which you hear Robert Plant doing as well in their version. Earl Hooker was given songwriting credit for Blue Guitar, but You Shook Me was credited to Dixon and Lenore. Now, many blues fans have angrily accused Led Zeppelin of ripping off Willie Dixon by not crediting him for both You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You Baby, but he is credited on the back cover of the original vinyl release for Zeppelin, so I don't know where these accusations come from, unless there were, of course, alternate pressings that incorrectly credited Page and Plant. If so, I haven't seen them. But proper songwriting credits have been listed on subsequent re-releases. Robert Plant also incorporates lines from the Robert Johnson song Stones in My Heart with the lines, I have a bird that whistles and I have a bird that sings. But I don't feel that this constitutes plagiarism as it does a shout-out to Robert Johnson. John Lennon does this similar thing with the opening line of Here Comes Old Flat Top from Come Together, which is taken from a Chuck Berry song. And I see it as just a shout-out or a nod to those artists. Other blues fans have been critical of both these covers, stating that they are not real blues, but I couldn't disagree more. I think that both do an exceptional job of reimagining these songs for a new audience, while still staying true to their original roots. In fact, I feel that both of these recordings still sound relevant even now, and that neither recording sounds outdated. My personal feeling is that this criticism comes from blues purists who don't like any kinds of reinterpretations of any blues standards. I also feel that there is also just some general resentment from blues fans because the Led Zeppelin versions got so popular that for a while their covers became more well-known to the general public than the original versions. Track 5, Dazed and Confused. Now, the criticism of plagiarism is well-founded on this track. The fact that Zeppelin stole Dazed and Confused from folk singer Jake Holmes has been widely cited for years. I first read about it in the 1985 unauthorized biography, Hammer of the Gods. To me, this is an open and shut case. Jake Holmes wrote, recorded, and released this song, and filed a copyright registration for it back in 1967. Jimmy Page's previous band, the Yardbirds, had in fact covered this song while Jimmy Page was in the band. Then Yardbirds drummer Jim McCarty even mentions going to buy the Jake Holmes record so the band could learn the song. The lyrics were completely rewritten, keeping only the lines, "Been dazed and confused." Holmes' original lyrics are very much darker and more cryptic than Led Zeppelin's rewrite. The 1985 book Hammer of the Gods states that Holmes' original song describes a bad acid trip, but Holmes contradicts this in a 2005 interview, stating that it is a relationship song, and that people probably confused it as such because of the experimental jam session in the song's middle. Zeppelin's rendition of Dazed and Confused is a stunning epic of metal, blues, and psychedelics. It became a signature song for them in the pre-Stairway to Heaven days. But no matter how Led Zeppelin might have rearranged it, it would not exist without Jake Holmes' original version, which I do recommend that you listen to. Jake Holmes' original version with its stark acoustic guitar arrangement is, in my opinion, as powerful in its intimacy as Led Zeppelin's is in its thundering bombast. Jimmy Page claimed sole songwriting credit on that track, so I have to assume that the decision to steal the song was his and his alone. So the first question I have to ask is, what was he thinking? Now, I could cut Jimmy Page some slack and say that, like most of the general public, he didn't understand what copyright is, how it works, or what it means. At the beginning of the rap era, many rap artists rapped over existing copyrighted recordings. Many of them thought that since they had altered the original by adding their own lyrics to it, that it was now transformed, and that now they owned their version lock, stock, and key. But a judge stated that their version would not exist without the original version, and that before releasing a transformed version of someone else's original work, they must not only get permission, but also give songwriting credit and pay royalties. There might be some argument as to whether or not Zeppelin's version is, like any rap song that samples an existing piece of work, a transformation or a straight-up cover. And if Page, in his youthful naivety, thought that by changing it, it was now his, he should have made up for this mistake in his later years. Jake Holmes said that he did write Led Zeppelin back in the early 80s, requesting at least co-credit and remuneration. He never got a response. In 2011, Jake Holmes finally sued Led Zeppelin for plagiarism. The case was settled out of court. Now, the second thing I have to wonder is, why did he wait so long? A simple phone call from a lawyer to Atlantic Records could have gone a long way back then, especially since he had filed a copyright registration. Unlike Ann Bredon, Holmes was aware of Zeppelin's recording. I have no idea how much of a settlement he received. Obviously, it was enough to settle out of court. But even if we look at Zeppelin's remake as a transformative work, Jake Holmes should receive co-writing credit. The latest release of Dazed and Confused from the album Celebration Day lists the song as written by Jimmy Page and inspired by Jake Holmes. I like Led Zeppelin's version, and I am glad that it has now led me to find the original version. But claiming authorship of a song that you didn't originally write is, to me, as bad as a professional athlete who uses steroids in order to beat their competition. Track 6, Your Time Is Gonna Come. Bassist John Paul Jones, besides being an excellent bass player, doesn't ever really seem to get enough props for his keyboard playing. I'm not sure why this is always so overlooked whenever Led Zeppelin is discussed, because it's certainly on full view here with this song's introductory organ solo. I love this keyboard solo. It sounds so authentically like something out of the classical music era, so much so that I believe that it could fool the uninitiated if you told them this was a Bach organ piece. And then it moves effortlessly and even seamlessly into a blues organ mode before the band joins in. This is my second favorite song on the album. Page's guitar licks evoke both blues and country, and sometimes they evoke them simultaneously. But it's John Bonham's drums that keep you aware that this is a rock band. There is a sensitivity to Page's guitar playing that just beautifully contrasts Plant's darker lyrics about a deceitful partner. Without this, Plant's vocals would have probably sounded a lot angrier. The song's main character has realized that he's been deceived, but he's no longer angry, and he's moving on. He knows that he doesn't need revenge because karma is going to take care of that for him. Track 7, Black Mountainside. Just as Your Time Is Gonna Come showcased John Paul Jones's keyboard playing, so too does Black Mountainside showcase Page's instrumental abilities on the acoustic guitar. Black Mountainside is a short tour de force for Page, but it is also the subject of plagiarism allegations, for its obvious similarities to Irish folk music artist Bert Jansch's recording of the traditional Irish folk song Black Waterside, sometimes referred to as Down by the Waterside. By the way, I want to apologize if I'm mispronouncing Bert Jansch's name. This is the best I can do. Now, you don't have to go any further than the Wikipedia page on either Black Mountainside or Black Waterside to learn that Jimmy Page was taught how to play Bert Jansch's rendition of the song by musician Al Stewart, whom Page was working as a session musician on Stewart's debut album during his pre-Zeppelin days. When Page recorded his version, he didn't credit Jansch, he credited it to himself. But here's the part that makes me pause. Black Waterside is a traditional public domain folk song. The original author is unknown. Page's version borrows heavily from Jansch's version, copying his rhythm stylings and copying the main melody of his vocal line on lead guitar. But Page does add his own melodic and rhythmic stylings as well as the use of tabla drums, which immediately transforms it from its Irish roots into something more Arabic sounding. And this would foreshadow the heavy influence that Arabic music would play into the band's music a few years later, when Page and Plant traveled to Morocco to experience this music firsthand. The track fades in as Your Time Is Gonna Come fades out, and I was always kind of bugged that I couldn't clearly hear the opening notes of that song. I was glad that the 1980s box set gave me a version that was free of the Your Time Is Gonna Come fade out. But since the song was in the public domain, Jimmy Page didn't need to steal it. His recording could have just been credited as traditional, arranged by Jimmy Page. Personally, though, I think it should have read something like traditional, arranged by Jimmy Page, from Bert Jansch. For the record, Bert Jansch in interviews feels that Page did rip him off, or at least learn the song from him. I agree. Page did learn the song from him. Jansch did try to pursue legal action, but had to give it up since the song's melody is in the public domain. Legally, this is not plagiarism, but it is deceptive to take a public domain song and claim it was your own original piece of work. Ethically speaking, I think the songwriting credits should acknowledge the song's history, and that out of respect for history, that the original title be restored. Jimmy Page is not in the wrong here legally, but I do believe he's in the wrong ethically. Track 7, Communication Breakdown. Like Good Times, Bad Times, this song is surprisingly short by Zeppelin standards, and in spite of its almost punk-like main guitar riff, it sounds surprisingly commercial and radio-friendly, especially for the radio of the time, which favored songs of about 3 to 3.5 minutes in length. I have often wondered if, in fact, Communication Breakdown was an attempt by Page to record a radio-friendly song. If so, it was a tack that they would soon abandon, as Zeppelin developed a reputation for getting radio airplay by defying commercial radio demands. One of the primary sources for plagiarism claims that I've been citing has been the YouTube video by YouTube user ClashBoy1977. While this video makes some valid claims, I feel that some of them are invalid. Case in point, the assertion that Communication Breakdown is ripping off Nervous Breakdown by Eddie Cochran. I personally feel that there is no validity to this accusation. This video makes a comparison between the song's titles and the fact that a similar guitar riff is played between the lyric breaks, and now other bloggers have picked up on it as a claim of plagiarism as well. But if you listen to them back to back, Communication Breakdown and Nervous Breakdown sound nothing like each other. In fact, if Nervous Breakdown sounds like anything, it sounds like Summertime Blues, which was also recorded by Cochran in the late 50s and released then. Nervous Breakdown was not released until after his death in the 60s. Also, the idea that Communication rips off Nervous Breakdown because of a similar guitar riff in between each line of verse doesn't hold water for me either, because while the songs use a D-A-D or a 7/5/7 chord change, the riffs are timed differently. Secondly, there are lots of songs that use a 7/5/7 chord change progression in the same way that lots of songs use a 1/4/5 progression. Is it possible that Jimmy Page heard Nervous Breakdown and it inspired him to write Communication Breakdown? Possibly. Does this situation constitute plagiarism? No. The songs sound way too different from each other, both melodically and lyrically. Track 9, How Many More Times, and the last track on the album, is punctuated by a very cool guitar riff that combines blues, metal, and funk. In his video Led Zeppelin Plagiarism Part 1, ClashBoy1977 states that while How Many More Times has different lyrics, he feels that it is clearly based on and stolen from How Many More Years by Howlin' Wolf. But the two songs sound nothing alike. Actually, the song by Howlin' Wolf that we should be discussing is No Place to Go. True, the opening guitar riffs sound similar, but they are also different. No Place to Go by Howlin' Wolf starts on an A and descends to G, E, and D before climbing back up to E and then repeating. Zeppelin starts on E, goes up an octave to E, descends to D, B, and then ascends up to D and E. Similar but different. And this guitar riff by itself would not constitute plagiarism of the song. But the vocal melody is too similar, and by the second verse, the lyrics become too similar, with Howlin' Wolf singing, "How many times you gonna treat me like you do?" Later during the song, Page adapts lyrics from The Hunter by Albert King and adds them to the midsection of How Many More Times. This is deliberate and could in no way be considered coincidence. And it's also just too much use of the Albert King's lyrics to just call it a shout-out. With its epic instrumental break, there are clearly differences between How Many More Times and No Place to Go, and perhaps the band thought that they had changed this song enough that it was now theirs. There is always the possibility that they might have just subconsciously copied this song without realizing it, but the similarities are so close that I have trouble buying that. But the controversy doesn't end there. During the instrumental break, there is a section, a brief guitar passage that sounds suspiciously like Beck's Bolero. It's brief, less than 20 seconds. But here's what most people miss. Jimmy Page, who recorded the song with Beck in the studio, has a songwriting credit for Beck's Bolero. And with the exception of its initial release, Page's name has been listed as a songwriter on every copy that's been issued ever since. Both Beck and Page agree that Page came up with the Bolero-influenced chords and rhythm, but disagree over who wrote the guitar melody line. But Page does have a composer credit, so he's not out of bounds for using it in How Many More Times. Page also asserts that he produced the track but has never been credited for it. You would think that this alone would have made him more sympathetic to Jake Holmes. In my opinion, How Many More Times is a remake of Howlin' Wolf's No Place to Go. Led Zeppelin has transformed it into an epic piece of rock, and that may or may not give them the right to add their names to the songwriting credits of this version. But it should be credited at least as originally by Howlin' Wolf, and include a mention of the use of Albert King's The Hunter as well. And this concludes my in-depth look at the debut album of one of rock's most influential bands. On this album, there are a few valid claims of plagiarism, even though I believe that one of them was completely accidental. But there are also some completely overblown and invalid claims too. It is not only legally wrong to knowingly plagiarize someone else's works, it is morally wrong too. But before we all go on witch hunts, bear in mind that there are only 7 notes in music, and so at some point, all music artists have unknowingly or subconsciously copied the work of others. I have done it too, much to my embarrassment. La Bamba and Twist and Shout use the exact same chord progressions, yet no one would assert that one is a ripoff of the other. Led Zeppelin I remains a stellar debut album. Now, if you're wondering why I am not discussing any other songs from their subsequent releases that have been charged with plagiarism, it's because those songs are for the day that I cover those albums, if I ever do. But out of their entire catalog, I would say that there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 songs that need some adjustments to the songwriting credits. This is either because of the fact that they are transformative of another song, or in a few cases, they are an uncredited remake. There are certainly some wrongs that need to be righted in regards to this in the form of proper credit and compensation. And an apology wouldn't hurt either. But that does not negate the rest of the brilliant work Led Zeppelin has contributed to the world of music, and it starts with this album. For Music Worth Buying, this is TJR. Thank you so much for listening, and please subscribe to the channel.